Hey friends, it's Mike with Riding in the Ozarks, and I just crossed 60,000 miles on my Street Glide. It's a 2016, and you know what that means? It means we can do a 10,000 mile review of the progressive suspension I put on last year. So about 8 months ago, I did a video about how I was choosing the best suspension for me for my Street Glide. And I compared multiple brands and showed you how I came to my decision and why I chose the progressive 944 shocks and the front fork kit and all those things. If you want to know more about why I chose it, put a link to that video up here. I'm not going to go through all of that again, but I may mention some things that are related to that video. But for those of you that don't want to go watch the video, the highlights is this suspension fit my budget monetarily, and I really like the 944 shocks because you get the travel of a 13-inch shock and a 12-inch factor. So my Street Glide special here didn't have to be raised up for me to get an increase in travel over the factory suspension. Not to mention this is a much higher quality, suspension, the shock itself. Now I've had different comments on that video. Some people saying other brands are better, this or that, or one guy said the 944s were way too stiff for him. The only thing I can say is if you do purchase something like the 944 shocks, they come in two different spring weights, standard and heavy duty. If you get heavy duty and you're riding solo and you're not gonna be over 250 pounds, you got the wrong shock. You need standard. If you're gonna be under 250 pounds, you need the standard weight shock and not the heavy duty. Having the heavy duty shock is gonna make it ride stiffer. I have another friend who bought the shocks. His bike has got a whole bunch of fiberglass body parts. He's a skinny guy. He has a little bit of a hard time squatting the suspension on it, but he's probably gonna have that with most suspension. He had air ride before that, so it didn't matter. He wasn't really setting the suspension for weight, he was setting it for ride height. But that's a whole nother story. Now, I did not install the suspension myself. I had it installed at a shop for a couple of different reasons, and I'll touch on those real quick. For one, because I'm doing a review of this, I wanted it done by a professional. I didn't want anyone saying that I didn't install them correctly or I didn't do something correctly and that's why it was wrong, or if I had a problem with them and stuff like that. I didn't want anyone to think it had to do with my abilities as a mechanic or something I may have done wrong. So they were installed by someone who is very well qualified, very experienced. In fact, the guy who installed the shocks just retired. He's been working on Harleys for 30 years and he's worked at multiple dealerships. He's a very, very good mechanic. So I have complete faith that everything was installed correctly. The second thing is for me to record it and do it, especially if I'm not familiar with the process, is gonna make it take 3 or 4 times longer. So I didn't wanna do that. So I paid him to install the suspension and I recorded while he did it. I will say that if you are not mechanically inclined, I would recommend having the front forks installed by a shop or a mechanic, someone with experience. Could I do it? Yes. Did I have all the tools that he had to do it? Not as easily. For example, he had a triple tree from an older touring bike that he was able to put into a vise and then put the tubes into that triple tree to clamp them, to hold them while he worked on the suspension and put everything back together and stuff. So he didn't have to rig up some kind of jig or something else to hold the suspension. He had the parts and the tools and things that he has used to do this before readily available. Now before we get into the front suspension, I want to kind of mention that because these YouTube videos are global, some people don't know what the Ozarks are and what it's like riding in the Ozarks. We have some very twisty mountainous regions here. I don't live but a couple hundred miles from the Boston mountain range. I have rode this bike with the suspension on it in northwest Arkansas and through the Boston mountains, through Pig Trail, on the actual scenic byway multiple times in the last 10,000 miles. Spring Fling, Bikes, Blues, and Barbecue. We went that way to go to the K River camp out, so in Oklahoma. So I have put this suspension through some pretty good paces for a touring bike. Now this isn't a sport bike, but I put it through some good paces and rode some really good roads on it. And I can tell you that immediately my confidence in the handling of the bike improved. I felt the bike could take corners better, could handle corners better. Before I changed the front suspension, I felt like when I would get in a corner, almost like the bike was trying to skip sometimes in the corner as I was leaning. Like it wasn't holding and tracking that line. You know, the suspension was much more plush. The nose diving was much more extreme. This doesn't dive easily, but it will dive the front end still if I have to slam on the front brakes. Not that I slam on the front brakes a lot, but I did test it, and it still has a little bit of dive, but it's not bad. It's not anything that shouldn't be there. What I really felt, besides the confidence improvement, was the little like crevices in the road, and sometimes you feel like it's, you know, guiding your bike. Like when you get on a tar snake and your bike wants to track down that tar snake. And big grooves, that still happens. But little grooves, I didn't notice it. I had people who were riding with me on the road who commented about how they felt like the bike was tracking in these grooves in the road. And I didn't feel that in this bike after I did that suspension change. At least not unless they were, you know, significantly bigger grooves or tracks that, you know, it would want to follow. I think the handling's better. The ride is definitely better. Can I still hit a big bump in the front end, go clang? Yeah. I mean, if you hit a big speed bump too fast coming out of the marina in Kansas when you're doing the $5,000 poker run, it still will jar you a little bit. But the suspension is much improved. This front suspension and the 944s in the back have Progressive Suspension's patented FST technology, which is frequency sensing technology, and frequency meaning how frequent the bumps are. So you get into a section that's really bumpy, the pressure in the valving and the suspension can sense that, and it corresponds and, well, it responds to those road conditions, and the suspension adapts to it to make the ride a little stiffer, a little better when you get into significantly rough areas. And once it smooths back out, the valving and everything can sense that you're no longer in a bumpy area, and the suspension smooths back out and becomes a little softer. Now, when it comes to the rear suspension, that is something that's pretty easy for most people to install. It's not really complicated. You probably do want to have someone helping you though, so you can correctly set the sag for the suspension. And I talked about that in the other video. I'm not going to get into that a lot, but basically your sag should be about 1/3 of your travel. So if you have 3 inches of travel, then you want the bike to sag 1 inch when you sit on it. That is your sag. That is how you do that. But anyway, the 944s on the back have been great. I'm really happy with them. I went with standard suspension, standard rate springs, because I am going to ride solo most of the time on this bike now that Firecracker has her own Sport Glide. She did 8,000 miles on it last year. She rarely rides with me. When she does, we're over the 250 mark. It doesn't take much to get over the 250 mark when I'm riding solo, but I can stay under 250 with gear and me until she gets on there. And when she gets on there, we're usually only going 10 miles. And it's not been bad. I haven't seen anything that has made me feel like, oh, I shouldn't do this. The suspension's bottoming me out easier or anything like that. I don't know what to tell you about the 944s in the back other than I don't feel like they bottom out near as easy. I feel like the bike is a little stiffer than it was with the factory suspension. Now granted, when I did this, the bike was at 50,000 miles, and I believe that's when you're supposed to redo the fork oil and the front suspension and stuff anyway. But the back suspension was really, I felt like, slacking the last 10,000 miles. From 40 to 50,000 miles, I felt like it got significantly worse. Whether they were wore out or whatever it was, I don't know. But I felt like there was more sway in the bike didn't track and didn't corner as well. I had less confidence in it, as I mentioned before. After putting the suspension on, I think it rides great. I'm more comfortable, I'm more confident in the bike and my abilities on the bike. I feel like it does what I tell it to do, and I don't feel like I'm fighting the bike to keep it in the corner at the angle or at the lean that I'm looking to have as I go through that corner. So I'm really pleased with the suspension. I'm really happy with it. Like I said, this isn't so much an install as a review, but the suspension is easy to put on. The front suspension, again, I would say if you're not a shop or pretty mechanically inclined, then you probably want to pay someone else to do that. All right, guys, if you have any questions, leave them down below. I'll do my best to answer your questions. If you have any, go back and watch the video about why I chose these. If you want to know how these compare price-wise and feature-wise to Legends, Öhlins, or Fox, and why I chose these over those brands. Love you guys. Thank you for all the support. The channel's really been booming this month. my best month ever on YouTube, and I couldn't do it without you guys. But all of you guys watching my videos just kind of remotivates me to make these videos, to share stuff with you guys, and I really appreciate all your support. Y'all stay safe and keep on riding.